Welcome everybody to Coffee and Open Source. I'm glad that you can be with us today. We have a great interview. I have my coffee ready. Let's get started. So today my guest is Claire Novotny, Executive Director of the .NET Foundation. Say hey, Claire.
Hi, Isaac. How are you?
I'm doing great. So Claire, do you want to just get started and just give a quick intro to kind of who you are, and then we're just going to get into a great interview about coffee and open source.
Sure. I mean, anyone that knows me knows that I love coffee and I am one of the biggest coffee snobs out there. So I'd love to talk to you about coffee and cappuccino and espresso as long as you want. Open source? Uh, what's that, right? It's
Yeah,
just that thing.
exactly. Do you have a coffee, or are you just drinking water today?
So I had my second coffee already just before as we were prepping for this. I feel like if I try to limit myself to two a day to try and be good, not be too jittery.
And when you have a coffee, is it like so? I have I had a work colleague that used to say there's normal coffee and there's hipster coffee. Are you in the hipster coffee variety, or do you occasionally will get like you know, a Seattle brand coffee, or maybe a more notable
Oh, I don't do
local roaster?
Seattle coffee because you don't know how to do coffee out there. You burn it.
Okay, okay,
So I do have I use a local farm here in New York. It's called Irving Farm, and they have a lot of blends and single origin roasts from their producers. So I like the one that they have called Highline.
oh,
It's a
okay.
lighter, crisper uh, bean, and it makes a very nice espresso. So,
That's so you prefer an espresso.
well, I kind of go Italian style. I'll do my cappuccino in the morning up until 11 or so, and then in the afternoon I'm going to go straight to the espresso.
Yeah, my wife and I recently got into the habit of doing cold brew, which is basically you just brew coffee and let it sit in your fridge overnight. Um, uh, there's more to it to that, but it's so strong, and I'm not like I don't prefer like the really bold flavors, so I just drink it as fast as possible.
So I'll
Just
I'll do that with Thai tea,
yeah,
and I'll take a quart of water, boil it, and then add a whole bunch of Thai tea to it, and then let it sit there for about and sugar. You need a bit of sugar. Let it cool for 2 hours with the tea in it, so it's going to get nice and strong and steep. Then you got to filter the tea out and then chill it overnight, and then there you go, Thai iced tea, and you don't have to pay $4 for it at a restaurant.
well, well, yeah, that's coffee, tea, any beverage. Like I've talked to my wife about this. Like anytime you like as someone who knows how much like for instance like uh a glass of soda costs, like actual like how much it costs for the syrup and the carbonated water, and the fact that you get charged $6 for it. Yeah, I get the evil looks every time because
It's crazy, and I
say
love
water.
seltzer. And so one of the things that I've had for years is a soda stream.
Yeah.
And I have 3 or 4 liter bottles in the fridge, and I never really use any of the flavor packets, but constantly
Mhm.
keep the soda full, and it's just something I prefer. So yeah, I don't need to go spend tons of money on bottled water and be wasteful.
Oh yeah, and what people probably don't realize is that there's nothing better with like a gin or a vodka or any other alcoholic beverage, if that is your decision to drink, than with a nice
Or
seltzer.
just cut up a
Yeah.
lime, squeeze some lime in
Yep.
it, and just a bit of lime juice and seltzer. Nice and refreshing on a hot day.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we can talk about beverages all day, but I think the real reason why people, want to hear from you is talking about open source, right?
Sure.
So you mentioned that you're the executive director of the .NET Foundation. We can talk about that in a little bit, but I want to get more. I want to talk more about you and kind of how you got started in open source, right? So do you remember the first time open source was approached by you? Like whenever, like the first time you came across open source, you're like, oh, this is interesting.
So I think I was casually aware of open source. I mean, I've been aware of it a very long time, but I've been involved with computers forever. And as a developer in the 2000s, as a professional developer in the 2000s and later, it's always been there. I mean, even in college, I remember Slackware Linux was a thing, and you would get a CD with the code to Linux on it, and it was the cool thing to do then was to compile your kernel. Like I don't know, you would do the make config or whatever. You'd answer 40 questions about what kernel options and flags do you want, and then I don't know, 20 minutes later, you'd have a shiny new kernel that you could boot. And I guess that was open source, right? I mean, that was kind of the way that was my perception or intro to open source was, pretty much Linux. And that was with the general public license, GPL code. You had to be careful about it because, the viral nature of enabling like big changes. Is this going to affect my stuff? And you may not want to do that. I should also add that I've always been more attuned to copyright and licenses than most, given that my mother is a copyright lawyer.
Oh, okay.
So my mother does copyright, trademark, and patent law, and as a kid growing up, whenever I might happen to say, show an interest in certain software that may not have been properly acquired, she would always give me a look and say, that's wrong. You can't do that. And I'd get the lecture about how it's stealing and how it's wrong and you have to pay for stuff. So it was something that I've been attuned to for a very long time. And, it's certainly been helpful throughout.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
But in the Microsoft space, it was one of those things. I've been using .NET since the very beginning, and open source wasn't something we thought about for a long time. It wasn't until 2005, 6, 7 when parts of MVC became open source that it really started to even become interesting.
Yeah.
But even there wasn't much you could do with it. It was, all right, so there's code there. Okay, sure. And at the same time, you had sites like Codeplex and other projects that were on SourceForge that would create their code in the open.
Mm-hmm.
From the very beginning, I was helping out with programs like RSS Bandit, which is a newsreader application that I still use to this day. I am dependent on it, and I will not give it up. It is running on .NET Core 3. I will get it on .NET 5 as soon as I get some control updates. But it was an open source project. It was just a way to jump in, get stuff working, get features working, and participate. This was all using CVS or Subversion or both at one point into SourceForge, and would just get stuff done. But you didn't really have a lot of libraries in the open then. It was a few applications, and I dare say it was hard to say that there was a community yet.
Sure.
Around that.
Yeah. Because now I think it's pretty obvious that like open source is synonymous with community, right? I think one of the interesting things that you brought up, so when you were younger, were you a bit of a tinkerer? Did you do the whole take apart your computer, put it back together?
Oh, yes. Yep. So my father worked at Digital Equipment Corporation and in Maynard and Hudson, Massachusetts. So we had computers in the house from a very early age. Back in those days, you were allowed to bring computers home from work for personal use. And so we were on DECnet. I mean, I remember we were connecting. We were doing ASCII art from some of the DECnet sites that were there.
That's awesome.
It was kind of cool as someone in elementary school.
Yeah.
And later on, I remember we had some 386 or some, I don't know, maybe it was a 286, something. And I would open the case up. I had my screwdrivers, Phillips heads, and I would take them apart. And my mother would walk by in horror because she would say, "What did you just do to the computer?"
Yeah.
Meanwhile, my father would walk by and say, "Don't worry about it. She'll put it back together again. It's fine." And, it was. I was always curious. I want to know, how did it work? What did it take? And then that went from the hardware to the software.
Yep.
I would read the code books in school. The library, I don't know if you remember this, the library had books like a lot of it were basic at the time, like
Yep.
basic language, not
Basic, yeah.
basic, right? But you'd have lines like 10, 20, 30, 40. It would be tens
Yeah.
of thousands of lines of code that you could type in and figure out how it works.
Mm-hmm.
So I would check those out of the library and play with them and figure it out, and I just taught it to myself.
Yeah, when I have these conversations with people in tech, it's always like my parents got a computer and I took it apart 1,000 times, and once I figured out how the hardware worked, I started either building websites, or maybe some people started on basic if they started programming a little bit earlier, but it all ends up I was always taking apart computers. And I remember when I was younger, I was so we didn't get a computer until I was like a sophomore in high school, and I remember just bothering my parents over and over and over again, and we finally got one. And within 2 days, it was completely taken apart.
Yeah, of
And
course. What else would you do?
exactly. And I remember my dad being like, "Well, if you can put it back together, you can keep it in your room." And then at that point, it was just like all day long, just da 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 da. Because my parents could care less about having a computer. It was for me, because they saw that I was interested in the stuff. But I always tied together to, even before computers, I used to take apart remote control cars. I used to just like
I did that
how
too. Yeah,
things
I had
work.
the
Yeah.
I love model rockets because I would
Yep.
build it and I would want to. I never really painted stuff, models of any kind,
Yep.
all the instructions, and it was always for me about the building. I'd get the
Yeah.
plastic glue and do it. Never had the patience to paint it.
Sure.
I'm sure some of that extends to this day. You look at what do you have attention to detail? Well, in
Sure.
some areas, but
Yeah.
coloring it and making sure everything is, maybe leave that to somebody else. But so I'd assemble them, and then it went to model rockets, and I thought it was so cool, right? The Estes model rocket kits.
It's
Put them
like,
together, put an engine, and see how high they could go.
so I live right outside of Seattle, and Seattle, outside of Seattle, there's a museum called the Museum of Flight. And
It's
occasionally,
an awesome museum.
yes, it's great. If anybody's in the area, they should go. It's because occasionally they have like collectors events there, so people come and bring all these model airplanes, and you see people ranging from like age 8 all the way to like 88. So I think it's one of those things where the people love to tinker, and that doesn't go away no matter how old you are.
Never.
So you mentioned a couple of things that I thought were pretty interesting, especially like getting started with some version of source code management into SourceForge and things like that. When did you realize, probably in your professional career, I'm guessing, when did you realize that, hey, this open source thing, like, it's something way bigger than just building silly things and having them available for download?
So I'd say that for me, that was when it really became something other than from applications and into something where, hey, I can give back and I can really help others, was back in 2010, 2011, 2012. And it was really right around the Windows 8 timeframe, I want to say. And there were some tools that we were working on, and I was working for a consulting company at the time, and there was just, in any software project, there's common pieces. There's pieces that you need to build for the client, for the project.
Yep.
But there's tons of infrastructure stuff.
Yeah.
And there's bits and there's tools you use, like, that you need to do something with and help you, like MVVM Lite, which is a fantastic library from Laurent Bunyan, was instrumental. I think that project has been around for a while. I think probably dating until I don't remember when he started it, but it was already a thing for probably 10 years now, easy. And you're building on stuff, and it occurs to you that, hey, look, we can give something back. So when I was working on a logging library and needed a way of getting this to work with a Windows 8 application, I was working with a library author, Matt Baxter Reynolds, who I just helped technical edit one of his books on, and he had a library called Metrolog. And this was a tool, a library that could just log stuff in your application to the disk. And up until then, there really wasn't anything that would work with Windows Store applications, Metro apps, right? Metro,
Metro apps.
before all that naming stuff, that's what it was, and that's why the library was called that. But back then, it's easy to forget. We didn't have we didn't portable class libraries were only just starting to become a thing.
Yep.
Most libraries at this point, if there was a desktop stuff, it was for WPF or Windows Forms. It was targeted at .NET 4 probably, or maybe 4.5. Windows Store apps were unfortunately a complete reset.
Yeah.
There was very little support of existing libraries, so there was an opportunity in there to port and adapt, to either create some libraries like Metrolog that filled gaps, or like in the case of Ninject. Ninject at the time was a popular dependency injection library, but like many libraries, they didn't have Windows Store support. So I was able to go and fork it, make it a version that worked for the store and with portable class libraries, and use kind of the bait and switch techniques that many of us have become more familiar with these days. But I wasn't going to just do this for myself. This was, look, I need this in my application, but if I find it useful and I can, for me, the challenge, the puzzle was digging in, was figuring out I can make this work.
Yep.
But other people shouldn't have to. That's always been my philosophy. I mean, I want to find things and create and fill gaps in the tool chain so that other people don't have to get stuck and they can go build really cool things.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think one of the things that resonated for me is doing something that somebody else has to do as well, right? Like, as most developers, I'm like this, I'm assuming you're like this too, is hate doing something more than a couple of times. So you always write silly little things to automate. And if you do something a few times, your immediate reaction is, well, probably other people have similar things to this too. And I imagine that's how most open source ideas come from, right? Is people are like, man, why is this hard? Why do I have to do this? Like, you brought up a couple of well-known libraries like MVM Lite and Inject. Their exact presence.
I worked with Laurent's library. Yep. Again, this was on, I think that one was on Codeplex at the time. It's been so long, my memory, like I can't keep track of where things started and migrated to. I mean, now they're all on GitHub because GitHub kind of won the world. But it was one of those things where MVVM Lite didn't work. It was great on WPF, but there was nothing for Windows Store applications. So I had contacted Laurent and I had a fork and said, look, here is the bait and switch, here's the portable version, here's the here's some stuff, here's how to make what we can work on Windows 8. And eventually, over the years, I got to know him, and he's an amazing person.
Yep.
So you get to meet more people and just kind of just jump in. And, ultimately, he wound up taking the work that I had done and incorporating it into MVVM Lite. And I think, and that's something I'm proud of, because it's the kind of thing where I can give back and, I don't need to keep maintaining this thing forever, but I can maybe do and fill a gap and hand it off. And I think so. I think the theme here is that in the course of doing work, I was actively looking for opportunities where I could improve the foundation of the tools I was using.
Yeah.
And XUnit was another one. So XUnit at the time, the 1.0 version of XUnit supported .NET Framework. And I needed a unit testing framework for .NET, for Windows Store. And it was necessary to get that working in order to prove that the things I was porting, like Ninject and MVVM Lite, if I'm going to submit a pull request, I need their tests to pass.
Yeah.
So as I go through the dependency tree, I get to XUnit and I say, oh crap, how do I get this working? And I say, oh well, I don't want to, MS test works somehow, and there was no documentation on how MS test got itself working in a store app, talking to Visual Studio so that the tests would show up. It worked, but I actually then took the time to dive in using Reflector and other tools to reverse engineer how did this work.
Yeah.
And then again, work with Brad Wilson from XUnit to figure out, oh, here's how we can support Windows Store apps and Windows Phone apps in XUnit. Again, I needed to do it because I needed it to prove that the libraries I was porting worked.
Yep.
Some days I think Brad doesn't forgive me for making his life way more complicated by multi-targeting and having it support all these other frameworks. So
I mean, I think Brad probably recognizes that without your help, it would have probably taken far longer too, right? One of the things that's really interesting as well is like, so you're talking about starting out as a contributor to other projects, like you mentioned VM Lite or XUnit, but over the course of time, like you have built a ton of libraries and applications that are hosted in the open that a ton of people use. You want to talk about them a little bit?
Sure. I mean, again, everything I've done so far is really in that theme. I need stuff to fill gaps. So there was a time like when multi-targeting started to become a thing. And say, when DNX just came around, if we remember that back in 2015 and 2014, when .NET Core was just out there, and all of a sudden, you could, instead of having to do bait and switch, and you had to, do all kinds of weird tricks, you had a project system which could build multiple targets all at once. But those multiple targets were, .NET Standard, .NET Core, and .NET Framework, and that's all it supported. But the ecosystem is bigger than that. We had Xamarin at the time. We had Windows Store or Windows 10, depending on what era. We still had legacy portable class libraries. There's a lot of other stuff, and I mean, I just kind of dove in and I said, look, what do we need to do to hook up those targets, the build mechanisms that are already there? I mean, my goal was not to reinvent anything. That's not how it worked. It was really to put the glue code in so that multi-targeting would understand and could find the targets and tools needed that were, that could be done the old way. So just again, it was one of these things where trying to make it easier.
Trying to build bridges. That's all you're doing, Claire, is just building bridges.
I mean, another one, OS Version Helper, was one where when it's for all kinds of compatibility reasons, it is much harder than you might expect in order to get the true version number of Windows. Windows likes to lie to you. And it does so because too many applications have built assumptions on and compatibility checks. And if they say this is, supports Windows version 6.0 point whatever, maybe that they didn't properly check something and Windows 10 would have worked. So Windows 10 will lie. And if an application says, hey, I'm an old application, I was written before Windows 10 even was a thing. I don't know a thing about Windows 10, but I'm calling this API to get the version number.
Yep.
Windows is going to lie and give it some older version that it's aware of, because Windows knows it's going to work.
Yep.
And it doesn't want to risk breaking it. But if you're in a case where you actually say, I do know about Windows 10, I want to know the build number. Maybe I want to do adaptive code and light up and call APIs that might be there. That was actually quite hard. And that was something that I had, seen that partly was done by the Windows Community Toolkit, but it was a helper function.
Yep.
And I said, look, instead of just keeping this buried in the Windows Community Toolkit, I'm going to take this, put it as a first-class library, and make this easier for other people to consume. Another case where another related feature of this is that in Windows 10, applications can run as loose applications. You just download something off the internet and run it, or they can be in an application container.
Yep.
Think a store application or MSIX, and there's some. Application virtualization isn't the right word, but it's a form of container that's running around the application that can do registry and file system virtualization and redirection and helps keep your machine clean and tidy.
Yep.
Good way to say it. Also, some APIs, like calling the notifications tray in Windows, need this concept of an application identity, which is provided by that container.
Yep.
But if you want to know, if suppose you're an application that may be in a container and may not be in a container, if you want to have a check to say, if I'm in a container, do this, and if not, do that, that was hard. And that's the kind of thing where you can reduce that and, again, put a library around it.
Yeah. And full disclosure, I use OS Version Helper in one of the open source projects that I have called Presence Light. So one of the things that you talked about, contributing open source, like in this, not to grandize things, but it made you pretty well known in the .NET community, right? And so if folks don't know, Claire, before she joined Microsoft, she was a Microsoft MVP. She was she's a regional director as well. And these are things that Microsoft gives to folks to, that are strong community champions, right? I'm probably missing some of the other 4,000 awards that she has, but it's one of those things where, people that do open source, they do it for the greater good and they do it for community, but there are some opportunities where you can be recognized for it.
I mean, I have to say, I've been privileged and lucky to be in a position where I've been able to spend reasonably large chunks of time to be able to do this. I mean, I definitely love to be able to give back. I love to be able to help others and unblock others succeed. But it was because I was able, in large part, because I was able to do that as a consultant, and because I was able to consciously split off, hey, here's client deliverables from here's, client subsidizing open source work because it's non-business logic, and being able to do that, it's a line you have to walk, but it's not, I've never been in a position, I've never worked for myself. I've always worked for other companies. Mm-hmm. So I recognize that it can be challenging to monetize and make money off of open source and spend a ton of time there. But I've been lucky that I haven't relied on that as my income stream. I've worked for others, and this is just something I've been able to give back along the way.
Yeah, that's great. And I think one of the things that's really important to call out is that when, like, I use the analogy, even though I'm not a huge fan of it, like the standing on shoulders of giants thing, right? Where if you give back, potentially, hopefully the people that are using your stuff in the future will give back. That's what happened with me. I imagine it's what happened with you and a lot of other folks. And, when you become, did you want to say something? No. Okay. So when, so getting back to kind of your, progression through things. So you're a community champion, you're well known in the .NET community, and then you decide to join Microsoft as the executive director. Do you want to just briefly tell me kind of how your day is?
Sure. So, I mean, no 2 days are the same. I'll say that. And that's one of the things I love about my job. I mean, as a PM, we do so many different things, and it's a lot of, cat herding is a good example.
Sure.
But I will start with day usually by checking on the news and Twitter, kind of seeing what's going on. It's the modern edition of reading the morning paper or
Yep.
papers, right?
Yeah.
What's going on? I'll check my GitHub notifications and try to see what I can and mark a lot as read. Maybe take some action, like the pointy clicky stuff that doesn't require focus time, right? Like
Sure.
we
Yeah.
all know what that is, right? Like my brain doesn't need to work, but I can point and click. I can review a PR, a small one. I can merge it.
Mm-hmm.
So try to funnel that off and then review my calendar and say, look, is this a day where I need to focus in on things if I can, which has been extraordinarily difficult during this, the recent months due to the pandemic.
Yeah.
But the areas that, if I need a chunk of time, I'll put a block of time in my calendar and say, I'm working on this blog post or I'm doing this thing over there. But then other days we'll have a smattering of all kinds of different meetings where I need to look ahead and say, oh, do I have time for lunch today? Or let me make time, or let me eat lunch early. Like today,
Yeah.
as an example, I had lunch an hour ago because I knew this is at noon. We started around noon Eastern time. I have a .NET Foundation corporate sponsors meeting in half an hour. And then I'm like, just my afternoon is just going to be meeting after meeting. And tomorrow doesn't look a heck of a lot better.
Sure.
It totally depends.
So what you're saying is that me sending you a meeting request for noon Eastern isn't very accommodating. I'll take note.
I'll say that it's very easy for folks on the West Coast starting their day at 9 a.m. to find that nice chunk of time that has been conveniently scheduled around by your East Coast colleagues because say we wanted to eat something.
Sure. And my only response to that is I've had plenty of colleagues on the East Coast send me meetings for 10 o'clock their time, which I'm not attending ever. So, so with that, I want to just preface this real quick. So, both Claire and myself, we work at Microsoft. Claire obviously is affiliated with the .NET Foundation as the executive director. I'm a paying member of the .NET Foundation as well as on the marketing committee. So one of the things that I think is really important to talk about with the .NET Foundation in general is that it's not just .NET-y stuff, right? There's other things that you've been able to accomplish as executive director. So one of the things I'd like to talk about really briefly is Dev Around the Sun,
Sure.
which was it was a 24-hour virtual conference that raised money for COVID-19 relief. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So after this idea started back around MVP Summit, this was middle of March, when Jeffrey Strauss, who's running for the board, and a number of others had this MetaConf that they've organized every year for organizers of other conferences. So they do KCDC, there's that conference. Many of the regional and larger conferences that you've heard of, their organizers will get together and talk about ideas on how to promote their events. And this was just after the shutdown started from COVID-19, and we were discussing things around what's the motivation to have these virtual conferences? What makes our events unique? If in many cases it was the local crowds, it was the interactions, and it was the local community, or some of them had water slides, others had other activities. And when you start taking these events and making them virtual, a lot of that can get lost in the mix. And so we were thinking, and it occurred to me that one thing we could do, and as a motivation, why do we want to have a conference, is that we could do a fundraiser. And it popped into my head something like Live Aid, which was a relief for famine in Africa that was done in the mid 80s or late 80s, I want to say. And it was an international event of rock stars that had come in to put on a massive event as a fundraiser. And we've always talked about jokingly or, you know, half jokingly that our industry has our own set of rock
Yep.
stars, the rock star developer. And the idea here was, all right, maybe we can get them together, get our rock stars, get our industry luminaries together to across audiences as a unity event and raise money for a good cause with some lighter material and do this over a, you know, follow the sun, a 24-hour event. And we did that we planned and executed that in 6 or 7 weeks, start to finish, and that took place at the beginning of early May, and we raised, I think, $57,000 for Direct Relief's Coronavirus Response Fund, and we had a lot of fun and a lot of success in doing that event. So that was definitely something we were thrilled to be able to host and put together and just bring everyone together in this challenging time for a good cause.
Yeah, no, like, I was fortunate enough to be a part of that as well. And I think that just the quality of the folks that you got doing the talks, and just the fact that, we talked about this a little bit, just the fact that we just made $50,000 appear and got to donate it to relief. That's just it's awesome. And hopefully in the future we can do things like that, maybe for something other than COVID, because I really don't want COVID to be
Sure.
around for another 8 months.
Yeah, the thing I love about it was that it was a community event. We had
Yep.
9 or 10 organizers, and I had never organized an event like this. This was genuinely a team effort and shows the power of the community when we can get folks together. We had Jeff and Jonathan Strauss, Jonathan Mills and Jeff Strauss, Heather Downing, Sarah Cooper with some graphics. You're on there. Chris Fanos is PM, and Christina Alden on some PR and marketing, and Jeff Fritz with his amazing live coders production staff. And I know I'm missing others, but this was one of those things where that shows the power of what people can do when they can come together to get it done. Because no one of us we were all had day jobs. None of us quit what we were doing to do this. This was all squeezed in along the side, and shows how, again, like, when the community comes together, we can do awesome things.
Yep.
And that's definitely something that we're trying to provide that platform for in the foundation, where we are trying to empower the community to run with some initiatives, whether it's through funding to make things happen, project support. The foundation itself strives to make the .NET ecosystem healthy. It tries to get some outreach and really just make things better. What that specifically means is really up to the community and the board.
Yep.
The board is there. Many people like to ask, so what is the .NET Foundation? What does it do? What is it like? Why do I care? What have you been doing? And I think one of the things that what the goal here is, we're a nucleus. We're the focal point. We have the infrastructure and organization to enable the community to come together and do something.
Yeah.
And that's really but it's ultimately up to the board to decide and say, hey, look, we want this year, or we want to do this. We want to focus on these activities. Let's encourage and enable the community to come in and participate in discussions, in hosting events.
Yeah.
There's been some awesome stuff that's happened. So even more recently, James Montemagano and John Galloway have put together a series of virtual meetup groups to try to amplify the existing virtual community using our global channel and platform in our marketing. Now, it's true that both of them do work for Microsoft. However, they're not working for the foundation as Microsoft employees. Like you, they're volunteers. and they're doing this as community members, which anyone can do.
Yeah.
Any community member can have an idea and say, look, we want to run this series of events. Here's our proposal. Here's what we want to do. And we'll help you, connect you with others, and give you resources to make that happen.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. Like, I think when I think so, as somebody who pays their dues in the foundation, I think the first thing that I think of is like, oh, how can I do more? How can I be, a part of this amazing community other than just providing funds, right? There are tons of ways to do so, I'd imagine.
Sure. I mean, right now the main way to come in is via the discussion forums on the GitHub site. So all members can go to the .NET Foundation GitHub organization, go to the Teams link at the top there, and there's 6 or 7 different areas which have discussions in them. And those are where the committees are having topical discussions. For example, the projects committee, which is led by Sean Walker, is working on looking at what projects are looking for. What benefits do you want as a member project? There's been questions and discussion out on Twitter recently over the past few months about what do I get as a .NET Foundation project? And while many of the services we do already provide are considered essential by many, like the IP support, the license support, these are the core basics that companies and others need in order to be able to use open source libraries and confidently. Mm-hmm. Many library authors are like, it's not, it's there, it's a checkbox, it's an important one, but there's more we can do, and there's some discussions happening in there, in the projects group around that.
Yep.
There's this notion of a seed project that we've been talking about. What does this mean? And there's been some of the discussions there have been, what if we want to have a collections class? .NET Framework doesn't have a modern collections library. It's not necessarily something that belongs, it's not part of the Microsoft core framework. It's not,
sure.
It's something that should be fostered and developed by the community as a seed. And is there something we can do that is more Apache style, if you will,
yep.
for these projects? Can we establish a project management committee? And I will shamelessly rip that from Apache and say, look, this project or these seed projects we're developing have a core committee that is responsible for its backlog and its direction, has contributors that have right access. I mean, Apache has an established model that works for many of their projects. Maybe there's things we can borrow and adapt from them.
Yeah, most definitely. I think.
And those discussions are happening. We want community participation. These discussions are not me and the board just in a closed room.
Sure. Yeah, no, to quote Hamilton, the Broadway show, like, you want to be in the room where it happens, right? And the room is very big in this scenario. The room is all GitHub/.NET Foundation. I think one of the things that might be very interesting to talk about is you mentioned the board, right? So there is an election coming up, right? Do you want to just give some more info about that?
Sure, yeah. The board of directors is, as I mentioned before, is super important to the foundation. They're the ones, the board is my boss. So I am actually not, I was on the board before I joined as executive director, and I stepped down in order to become executive director because in the foundation, the executive director reports to the board. The board is the one that has the power. They decide what should be happening. We'll look at the budget and we'll say, look, here's what we can do. Here's where we want to raise more funds. Here's what we should be doing. And try and put programs together and place things in place to enable the foundation to do things.
Yeah. I want to take just a little step back for a second. So
I didn't think I answered your question, though.
Oh, okay. Well, continue then.
The board has in the past had a 1-year term in order to improve the organization efficiency and had kind of reduced turnover. And we changed that up this year to be a 2-year term and are going to, so that we can have a stagger,
Sure.
so we can only have half the board elected every other year, or each year, half, so we don't have a full turnover, and keep some continuity in place. And we're going to have, we created a nominating committee to try and narrow down the list of candidates to those that had relevant experience.
Sure.
And that was there because the .NET Foundation, being on the board, despite having .NET in our name, is not a technical role.
Sure.
We're not doing API reviews. We're not checking code commits. We're here to build an organization. We're here to build a community to empower folks. Well, and we need people that can spend, let's say we said about 10 hours a month and help make these things happen. We need a working board.
Yep.
And so that's why one of the goals of the nominating committee was to kind of take a look at the qualifications of the candidates and say, okay, does this person seem to have relevant experience? And they were also supposed to go out and tap people on the shoulder and encourage them to nominate themselves to try and have a more diverse board as well. We're happy to have people on the board who have community experience running other foundations that may not even know .NET. Mm-hmm. And I welcome that diversity of ideas.
Yes.
We can teach the tech. We can teach, like, hey, here's who's who in our community. We can certainly benefit from the shared wisdom and experience that folks who have been involved with OpenJS and Ruby and Python and other ecosystems have, and help invigorate our own environment and ecosystem.
So when is the election?
So the current campaign period started last week and runs for another week. It's a 2-week campaign period. There's going to be a series of live interviews starting tomorrow and going through Friday. And we tweeted that out. There's be 3 hours scheduled tomorrow, noon, 4 and 7 p.m. Eastern time, and we're gonna have a time slot on Friday as well. So stay tuned for that. Those will be live. You can ask questions, and the results will be on our YouTube channel if you can't make it. And then the election itself starts on the 21st of August and then runs for 2 weeks. All members will be receiving a link with a special link where they can then vote, and it will be using the same voting system as last year, which is a ranked voting system. You can
the only way you should be voting, if I should just be honest, the only way you should be voting.
Results will be available at the first week of August, and the first board meeting with the new board is scheduled for the third, I want to say August 13th or 16th. That's whatever that Thursday is that week.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that there's not going to be a candidate debate. Like in some politics, you'll have like this huge list of folks and they just say terrible things about each other. That's not going to happen?
No, I think we're trying to keep this positive. I mean,
sure.
Let's keep this focused. We don't want to get everyone. This isn't any. Lots of people have a diversity of views and thought points, and we need the public we need you all to take a look and see who you think will be best suited to run. And despite elections, I mean, they are popularity contests. Yep. Let's try to go beyond name recognition. I encourage everyone to go through the bios on the website, watch the interviews, see any videos they've posted, and really maybe take solace in the nominating committee thinks each and every one of them can do an amazing job as a board member. So which of the ones that are for the folks that are there, are there any that speak to priorities that you're looking for? Are there ones that represent, opinions? Or please, we need a good board, and I'm super excited to see what gets picked because, taking this organization forward.
Yeah. So I'll just say one thing, right? So whenever you have an opportunity to vote, you should be voting, right? That's the only way that you feel that you're going to have the representation that you want. So voting is very important in every aspect of life.
Yep.
I wanted to finish off on kind of this general thought, right? So before you were executive director of the .NET Foundation, before you were on the board, you were a member of the .NET Foundation,
Mhm.
right?
I'm still a member.
Yeah.
I even as executive director, I've paid my dues.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things I'm very curious about from your perspective, since you've been at multiple levels of, I would say, type of membership of the foundation, even though we're all members, there's some members that have more responsibilities than others. So what was your original feeling about joining the .NET Foundation, and then obviously what convinced you to run for the board, and obviously move on to taking the executive director role.
So sometime in, I forget whether it was 2015 or 2016, one or the other, I was at the Connect conference, the Connect event that Microsoft put on in New York, and I was one of the, I was lucky to be invited on site. It was primarily a virtual event, but there were a small number of folks here, and I bumped into my friend Martin Woodward, who was the executive director of the foundation at the time, and I'd known him for a number of years from my time at Microsoft in the past and just in the community. And I asked him, I said, "Hey, Martin, I want to do more. How can I do more? How can I get more involved in the foundation and see how it can either be more impactful?" And he suggested that I can join the advisory council, and that's a group that provides feedback to the executive director and meets roughly monthly on that note. So I was on the advisory council for a couple of years, and then when there became an opening on the board, I think in 2018, sometime after a previous community director had stepped down, I was nominated by the board to be that community director. Because in the past, the foundation was 3 board members and the executive director, where 2 folks were from Microsoft. It was Scott Hunter and Miguel de Icaza. The community member for a while at the time was Rachel Reese. Rachel had stepped down. She wanted to pursue other things. And they came to me as someone that had been actively participating in the advisory council and helping set up a lot of the foundation's infrastructure. And I was more than happy and honored to be able to join and help out. And again, how can I have more impact? How can I be more useful to the organization?
That's great. I think it goes back to the entire conversation we've had about being a part of a community and putting yourself in a position where you're going to be helping others, because without any of this stuff, like, we're all just doing our job. Like, I think you might have even mentioned earlier, like, there's not a lot of money in open source, and the companies and the entities that have been able to be successful, like, that's not the norm, right? That's very much.
You look at Red Hat and their amazing sale to IBM. I mean, Red Hat certainly figured out how to make money in open source, but I think there's more work we can do as a community to try and figure out some solutions to these challenges. I mean, it's definitely something we need to look at long and hard at.
So what would you think is kind of the overall responsibility of the foundation?
So in my view, and again, the foundation is there to ensure the stability and health of the ecosystem. And I know that sounds short, but it's intentionally vague. There's no single thing that it does, and we try and address things where it's needed at the time, and also with an eye towards the future. And please, and the board is there to help guide it. We need the community contribution to help steer these things. There's a number of initiatives we're working on, but as with Dev Around the Sun, we can't do it without participation. This isn't a one-person show.
Sure.
It's not a show of the executive director and the board. The board are volunteers. They all have day jobs. We need people to kind of come in and help. If you're passionate, you want to do something, we're here to make sure to let you and empower you to do that.
Yeah. So, Claire, I want to thank you so much for coming on Copy and Open Source and just talking about your experiences in open source. The last thing that I want to ask it can be a one word, it can be a sentence. So, what does open source mean to you?
Open source to me, I think, means community.
Yeah,
That's it. If I have to say it in a nutshell, it's community, and I love our community, and you know I want to see us all succeed. I think a rising tide lifts all boats. I'm a firm believer in that, and I want to see that continue to happen for us in .NET.
that's awesome. So, thank you so much again, Claire, for joining me. And again, just to call out a couple of things. So, github.com/.NET Foundation. That's where you're going to find as much information as you could possibly want to know about all the things going on with the foundation. If you feel like you
And our
want to,
website.
was that?
And our website,
And the .NET Foundation
.NETFoundation.org.
website, which the source code, funny enough, is on GitHub. I think one of the things that is really important to call out is that without community, the .NET Foundation can't be as successful as it is. Is that fair to say?
Completely fair.
Right. Awesome. So thank you so much for your time. And yeah, we'll see you on another episode of Coffee and Open Source. Take care.
Thank you.